The vote was not even close. I watched it happen in real time from the observation gallery above the council floor, and I remember thinking that the silence in that room was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Not a whisper, not a shuffled seat. Just the cold, flat sound of a decision being made by people who had never once considered what it would cost them. The proposal was straightforward. Humanity had drafted it over 18 months, consulting every legal mind we had, every diplomat, every economist. We were asking for three things: a fair seat on the Resource Allocation Board, mutual defense obligations during border conflicts, and a review of the patent seizure that had stripped us of 11 years of medical research. 11 years. Work that had saved lives across 40 species, quietly taken from us, and redistributed under a clause buried so deep in the council charter that our own lawyers had missed it the first time. The Vreth Dominion representative did not even let the proposal reach the floor for a full reading. He raised his secondary limb, the one they use for casual gestures, and said something in his own language that the translation feed rendered as, "The children are asking for a seat at the table again." Then he laughed, a wet clicking sound that his species makes when something strikes them as too small to take seriously. 3 other delegations laughed with him. My name is Serafine Vasquez, and I was the senior human liaison to the Galactic Council for 9 years. I had sat in that gallery more times than I could count. I had watched humanity argue, petition, negotiate, and compromise. I had written speeches that never got delivered, because we were told our speaking slot had been given to a more senior delegation. I had filed formal complaints that were acknowledged, catalogued, and never read. I had shaken hands, or the equivalent, with beings who smiled at me in the corridor and voted against us in the chamber without blinking. I had seen a great deal in 9 years, but I had never seen what happened next. Secretary General Adele Drummond stood up from the human delegation table. She was 63 years old, with short gray hair, and the kind of posture that comes from decades of refusing to be overlooked. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture dramatically. She simply stood, straightened her jacket, and looked at the council floor with an expression I can only describe as final. She said, "We will not be returning." That was it. 6 words. No speech. No ultimatum. No list of grievances, even though we had hundreds. She picked up her documents, nodded to her team, and walked out of the chamber with every single human delegate behind her, including me. We did not slam the doors. We closed them quietly. That was 5 years ago. I am sitting now on the rooftop terrace of a building in Buenos Aires, watching the evening sky turn a deep, burning orange as a cargo hauler lifts off from the independent spaceport 2 kilometers south. It is enormous, that ship, longer than most council vessels I have seen, and it carries no council registry marker, just the Earth flag on its flank, clean and bright, catching the last of the sunlight as it rises. People tend to assume that when humanity left the Galactic Council, we were angry, that we stormed out, or that we spent the following years seething and plotting revenge. That is not what happened. Anger is loud. Anger is reactive. What we felt, most of us, was something much quieter and much more deliberate. It was the feeling of a person who has been waiting politely in a room for a very long time, who finally understands that no one is coming, and who simply decides to go build their own room. I did not cry when we left. I thought I might, because I had given 9 years to that place, and there is always something painful about giving up on something you believed in. But the tears did not come. What came instead was a kind of clarity, a sense of knowing exactly what needed to happen next, and understanding, for the first time, that we were completely free to make it happen. The council assumed we would be back within a month. I know this because Tavara, the Vreth ambassador who would later come to us asking for asylum, told me so years afterward. He said the general opinion among the senior delegations was that humanity would spend a few weeks being dramatic, realize how dependent we were on council trade routes and council licensed technology, and return with our heads lowered and our petition revised. They had seen smaller species try to leave before. Those species always came back. They had never seen a species leave quietly. There is a difference, and it matters enormously. When a species leaves in anger, they announce their departure. They make speeches about injustice. They hold press gatherings. They give the council time to prepare a response, to offer a token concession. to bring them back into the fold before any real damage is done. But when a species leaves in silence, when they simply stop attending sessions and close their embassies and go dark on the diplomatic frequencies without a single word of explanation, the Council has nothing to respond to. There is no grievance to address, no demand to partially meet, no emotional flame to pour cold water on. There is only the silence, and everything that grows inside it. Within 72 hours of Adele Drummond's departure from the chamber, every human embassy across Council space had been closed, packed, and cleared. Not abandoned, closed properly, with the lights off, the furniture covered, and the doors locked from the outside. Our diplomatic staff came home. Our trade observers came home. Our military liaisons on joint council operations filed the appropriate paperwork and came home. We did not leave a mess. We did not leave a note. We just left. I remember landing back on Earth and standing in the arrivals hall of the Buenos Aires terminal, and a young ground crew worker, maybe 20 years old, recognized me from the news coverage. He stopped and looked at me for a moment, this kid with grease on his hands and a wondering expression on his face, and he asked, "Is it true? Did we actually just walk out?" I said yes. He nodded slowly. Then he grinned, the kind of grin that starts small and takes over the whole face, and he said, "Good." That one word told me more about the mood of humanity than anything I read in the weeks that followed. People were not celebrating in the streets. There were no parades. There was just this quiet, deep exhale that seemed to pass through the entire human population like a slow wave. A collective release of breath that had been held for longer than most people realized. I watched the cargo hauler disappear into the darkening sky above Buenos Aires, its running lights becoming just two more bright points among the stars. A ship going somewhere on its own terms, not asking permission, not waiting for a slot in a council-approved transit corridor. Just going. I picked up my tea from the small table beside my chair and held it in both hands, feeling the warmth of it, and thought about everything that had happened in those 5 years since that door closed, about what we had built and what the council had discovered we had been holding up without anyone ever noticing, and what it felt like to watch the most powerful political organization in the known galaxy slowly understand that it had made a very serious mistake, a mistake it could not take back. I thought about Adele Drummond's 6 words, and about how sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is almost nothing at all. And I thought about the message we had received that morning, relayed through the Drev Collective's communications network, because our own Solaris Web did not officially accept council transmissions, a formal request for talks, signed by 6 senior delegations, including the Vreth Dominion. They wanted to meet. I finished my tea, watched the sky turn from orange to purple to the deep, steady black of a clear night, and I did not feel anger when I thought about that message. I did not feel triumph either. I felt something simpler and more honest than either of those things. I felt ready. Dr. Oren Malkiel had a habit of arriving early to everything. Not 5 minutes early, the way polite people do. He arrived 40 minutes early, minimum, because he said that the first 40 minutes were when you actually understood a space. You saw who came in nervous and who came in comfortable. You noticed which doors were used and which ones were avoided. You learned things that the meeting itself would never tell you. On the morning humanity left the Galactic Council chamber, Oren was not in that chamber. He was in a converted warehouse in the industrial quarter of Reykjavik, sitting in a folding chair in front of a whiteboard covered in diagrams, waiting for 11 other people to arrive. He was the first one there, 43 minutes early. By the time I met Oren properly, 3 years after the withdrawal, he had become something close to a legend inside what was officially called the Terran Sovereignty Initiative. Unofficially, among the people who had been involved in its earliest days, it was called simply the Plan. Not because anyone had decided to name it that, just because when people referred to it, that was the word they naturally used. The Plan. As though there had only ever been one plan worth the name. I visited him at the lunar complex during my first inspection tour as Director of Terran External Affairs. He met me at the entrance to the main facility, a long, low structure that had been officially registered with the old council records as a mining support depot, and he shook my hand with the particular firmness of a person who has been too busy to waste time on formalities, but wants you to know they respect you. He was a compact man, somewhere in his mid-50s, with close-cropped dark hair going silver at the temples, and the kind of permanent slight squint that comes from spending too many hours reading from screens in poorly lit rooms. He wore a plain gray coverall with no insignia on it, and he walked the facility corridors like someone who had mapped every centimeter of them in his sleep. "I always wanted to show someone this place," he said, as he led me past a row of fabrication units the size of buildings. Someone from the outside, someone who hadn't watched it get built piece by piece. "Why?" I asked. He glanced at me sideways. "Because when you've been building something for 20 years, you stop being able to see it. You only see the problems, the compromises, the things you would do differently." I wanted to see someone's face when they saw it for the first time. I tried to imagine what my face looked like. I was looking at a manufacturing facility that was not supposed to exist, producing components for spacecraft that carried no Council registration codes, using materials sourced entirely from supply chains that the Council had no record of or access to, and it was enormous. The ceiling of the main bay was 60 meters up. The floor space was larger than some cities I had lived in. "How long has this been running?" I asked. "Full capacity?" "About 2.5 years, he said. "But we broke ground here 23 years ago, back when it was just a geological survey team and a lot of very boring-looking equipment crates." 23 years. I turned that number over in my mind. 23 years before the withdrawal. 23 years before Adele Drummond stood up in the council chamber and said 6 words and walked out. Orrin and the people who built the plan had started preparing before most of the council's current senior delegates had even taken their positions. "You knew this was going to happen," I said. It was not really a question. He shook his head. "Not new. Understood. There's a difference." He stopped walking and turned to look at me directly. "The council was always going to fail us. Not because any one species was especially unfair, though some of them were, but because the system was built to protect those who were already powerful. Humanity had been growing too fast, getting too capable, making too many things that the older species needed. That's threatening to a structure that runs on fixed hierarchies. Sooner or later, they were going to find a way to put us back in a smaller box." "The patent seizure," I said. "The patent seizure," he agreed. "That was the third major warning, not the first." He started walking again. "After the second one, the trade tariff restructuring in 2089, I stopped waiting for a political solution and started designing an engineering one." He explained it to me over the next 3 hours as we walked the facility. The plan had 3 core pillars, and it had been running all 3 simultaneously for over 2 decades. The first pillar was supply chain independence. Every critical material that human industry needed, metals, rare compounds, atmospheric processors, energy components, had been quietly sourced through parallel networks that operated entirely outside council-controlled space. It had taken years of careful work with traders, explorers, and independent prospectors. Some of those suppliers did not even know they were part of a larger strategy. They thought they were just selling to unusually consistent buyers. The second pillar was technology, not just maintaining what we had, but quietly developing systems the Council did not know existed. The Solaris Web was the most important of these, a communications network built on principles completely different from the Council's standard relay architecture. It was not faster or flasher. It was simply separate, entirely outside Council monitoring, and by the time the withdrawal happened, it already had coverage across a sphere of space larger than the Council's own network had managed in 3 centuries of operation. "How did we build it without anyone noticing?" I asked. Orrin gave me a patient look. "Have you ever watched a very large organization try to notice things?" I had. I had worked inside one for 9 years. "Fair point," I said. The third pillar was the most interesting one, and it was the one Orrin seemed most proud of. Not in a boastful way, but in the way a person is proud of something that genuinely surprised them. "We went looking for allies," he said. "Not Council species, not powerful species. We went looking for the ones the Council had pushed out or ignored or actively kept small. The Drev Collective was the first, an insectoid trading species with a long memory and a deep grievance against Council shipping restrictions that had capped their commercial reach for over a century. The Council considered them minor, which meant the Council had never paid close attention to them. Orrin's team approached the Drev quietly, over years, offering engineering knowledge and navigational data in exchange for access to their established off-council trade routes. They were hesitant at first, Oren said. Their lead negotiator, a being named Sketh, no human tongue can quite get the click at the end, spent about 3 years just watching us, testing us, checking whether we'd keep our word on small things before she'd discuss anything large. And did we? Every time, without exception. He said it simply, like it was obvious. That was the strategy. Be exactly as reliable as we said we would be. Nothing more, nothing less. Let the reputation build on its own. The Murath Wanderers were next. A nomadic species with no fixed home system, constantly moving through territories the Council had declared off-limits, or strategically unimportant. Because they had no permanent location, the Council had never granted them full membership status, just a perpetual observer designation that gave them no votes and no protections. They were brilliant navigators and had mapped regions of space that no Council survey vessel had ever reached. In exchange for our help pushing for a legitimate home system claim, Oren said, the Murath gave us access to star charts that the Council didn't have, still doesn't have. Did we ever get them their home system? I asked. Something shifted in his expression, quieter, more careful. That one took longer than we promised, he said. But yes, eventually, yes. He looked away for a moment. The Murath were patient about it. More patient than they should have had to be. I think about that. We were standing outside by then, on one of the lunar complex's surface observation platforms, looking at a construction bay where 3 deep space vessels were being assembled simultaneously. They were not warships. They were large, capable, multi-purpose ships built for long-range independent operation, trade, exploration, and if necessary, the kind of quiet persistence that makes a statement without firing a single weapon. The Council thought we'd come back, I said. Tivara told me they were certain of it. Oren nodded. Of course they did, because in their experience, that's what species do. You push back, they protest. You offer something token, they accept and come back grateful. He watched a crane move a hull section into position with mechanical precision. They didn't understand that we'd already left before we walked out of that chamber. Physically leaving was just the last step. The actual departure had been happening for 23 years. There was a particular moment in his account that stayed with me more than any other. It was not about technology or politics, or the careful building of alliances. It was a smaller moment, human in the truest sense of the word. He described a night about 8 years into the plan, when the second funding structure had collapsed, and 3 key engineers had decided to take jobs with a Council-licensed company because they needed the security. The project's covert status meant Oren could not defend it publicly, could not make promises he was certain of keeping, could not tell the people he was asking to believe in this that he was sure it would work. I sat in that warehouse in Reykjavik, he said, which was not yet anything close to what it became, and I thought very seriously about whether I was being an idealist in the worst possible way. The kind who convinces other people to sacrifice things for a dream that might not be real. What made you keep going? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I went home that night and read an old history of the patent seizure case, not the diplomatic version, the medical version, the accounting of which treatments had been delayed because the research pipeline was disrupted, which patients had not received care they would have received otherwise. He paused. The number was not symbolic. It was specific. I read the specific number, and I decided that the question was not whether the plan might fail. The question was what I was choosing to do with the time I had. He did not name the number. I did not ask him to. We stood on the platform for a while without speaking, watching the construction bay below us, 3 ships being built by human hands in a place the Council did not know existed, using materials the Council had never tracked, toward a future the Council had never considered. 8 months after the withdrawal became official, a Council diplomatic inquiry arrived at what used to be the Human Embassy's public communications address. The inquiry asked, in formal terms, whether humanity had any concerns to bring forward regarding recent events. The inquiry received an automated response acknowledging receipt, with an estimated reply time of 90 to 120 business days. The Solaris web had gone online 4 months earlier and was already serving communications for 31 species. The Drev Collective had completed their first transit through a Terran-designed navigational corridor, shaving 14 days off a trade route that had been fixed for 60 years. The Murath had been given preliminary survey rights to a promising star system, the first formal territorial recognition any Murath navigator had ever received. And in a converted warehouse in Reykjavik that no longer existed, because its contents had long since been moved to facilities far larger and further away, a folding chair sat empty beside a whiteboard, waiting for the next problem that needed to be understood before it could be solved. What I am about to tell you, I know because Tavara told me, and I want to be clear about who Tavara was before I explain what he said, because it matters. Tavara had been the deputy ambassador of the Vreth Dominion to the Galactic Council for 11 years. He was not the one who laughed when our proposal was dismissed. That had been Senior Ambassador Greth Val, a being of considerable status and considerable certainty about the size of his own importance. Tavara was the one who sat 2 seats to Greth Val's left, who managed communications and documentation, and who, by his own admission to me, spent much of that final session staring at his notes and trying to look like a person with no particular feelings about what was happening. He came to us 4 years after the withdrawal, not by communicating through the Solaris web, which he could not have accessed without Drev assistance. He came in person, on a Murath transport, with 2 personal items and a file of documentation so damaging to the Vreth Dominion's internal decision-making records that 3 senior council officials reportedly spent a sleepless week discussing what to do about it. I met him in a small conference room at the Terran Sovereignty Station, orbiting the Earth-Luna L2 point. He was tall for his species, with the characteristic iridescent gray skin of the Vreth, and he carried himself with the careful stillness of someone who is used to being watched and has learned not to give much away. He sat down across from me, placed his hands flat on the table in what I had learned was a Vreth gesture of openness, and said, in very good human standard language, that he was sorry. I told him we could discuss that later, and that I wanted to hear what had happened inside the council after the withdrawal. He nodded, and he told me. I am going to recount it as he told it to me, because his account was the clearest picture I have ever received of what it looks like when an assumption collapses. The first 6 months after the withdrawal, Tavara said, the dominant mood among the senior council delegations was a kind of relaxed confidence. Several species had actually found the human presence in council proceedings mildly irritating, because humans asked too many questions during technical sessions and submitted too many formal complaints through official channels, which clogged the administrative process considerably. With humanity gone, the sessions moved faster, fewer objections, less paperwork. Ambassador Greth Val apparently told a gathering of allies that humanity had done everyone a favor by leaving. It was approximately 7 months later that the first quiet alarm sounded, and it did not sound in the council chamber. It sounded in a medical supply audit conducted by the Selhari species, a gentle, methodical people who kept extraordinarily precise records. The Selhari medical coordinator for their outer colonies filed a routine review and discovered that a class of nanite treatments used for cellular regeneration had not been restocked in 9 months. When she traced the supply chain, every route she followed eventually led back to a human pharmaceutical production facility. The facilities were not operating. Their council registry status showed them as inactive due to ownership transfer. The new owner was listed as a Terran sovereignty entity that had no council presence, no listed communications channel, and no mechanism by which the Selhari medical coordinator could place a new order. She filed a formal inquiry with the council's resource allocation board. The inquiry was acknowledged and assigned a reference number. 38 days later, with no resolution in sight, the Selhari began rationing the existing supply. Tavara's voice was careful and level when he described this, but his hands shifted slightly on the table. He had not been in the chamber when this became public knowledge. He had been in a side office reviewing a separate document when a junior aide came in and told him that the Selhari health report had just been read into the council record. I remember thinking, he said to me, that this was a small problem, the kind of administrative gap that gets fixed. Someone would contact the new supplier directly. The supply chain would be rerouted. It would take some time, but it would be resolved. It was not a small problem. Within 11 months of the withdrawal, 5 separate species had reported supply disruptions connected to previously human-managed production chains. The common thread in each case was the same. The products existed, had existed for years. Everyone had used them and depended on them, and the institutional memory of how they were produced and where they came from had been held almost entirely by the human companies and contractors who were no longer answering their communications. The Council's Resource Allocation Board convened an emergency session. Tavara attended as the Vreth Dominion's documentation representative. The session lasted 9 hours, he said. Most of it was spent trying to establish a baseline. Which products had human origin supply chains? How many? At what depth of the supply network? Because the direct products were the obvious ones, the things with Terran in the labeling. But what about components? What about processing equipment? What about the organisms used in biological synthesis that humanity had developed and distributed as part of standard Council scientific exchange? The answer, when they finally had something close to it, was not comfortable. Human innovation had threaded itself into approximately 42% of the goods moving through Council trade networks. Not 42% of the obvious technological products, 42% of all goods, including agricultural, medical, infrastructure, communication, and transport. The number seemed impossible until the methodology was explained, and then it seemed merely humbling. Humans had been innovating relentlessly for decades, sharing the results through trade and research exchange, and because the products were good and the prices were competitive, they had simply become the default source for a vast range of things that people needed. No one had tracked it because no one had imagined it needed to be tracked. Humanity was a junior species. Junior species did not matter enough to map. Tavara paused at this point in his account and looked at me across the table with an expression that I found difficult to categorize. It was not shame exactly. It was more like the look of a person who has found an error in their own previous reasoning so fundamental that correcting it requires rethinking every conclusion that came after it. The hypergate maintenance was the worst one, he said. In terms of immediate operational impact, the Council's hypergate network, the system of transit points that made travel across vast distances of space possible within reasonable timeframes, had been built over 3 centuries by many species working together. But the maintenance contracts, the technical upkeep, the ongoing calibration work that kept the gates running correctly, had been awarded to human engineering firms for the better part of 60 years, not because of politics, because human engineers did the work faster, for lower cost, with higher accuracy. 14 months after the withdrawal, the maintenance contracts expired. The Council's Technical Operations Department sent renewal notices to the relevant human firms. The firms were registered to Terran sovereignty addresses that did not accept Council billing systems. The renewal notices were not completed. The first gate anomaly happened 18 months after the withdrawal. A transit corridor near the Vreth Dominion's second trading hub began producing navigational drift, a subtle misalignment in the exit coordinates that resulted in ships arriving 200 kilometers from their intended destination. Not dangerous in open space, but the accumulating delays and rerouting costs were significant. The Council's own technical team spent 3 months attempting a recalibration before admitting that the diagnostic system used to run the calibration was itself a human-designed piece of software for which no one in the Council's employ had the source access to modify. They reached out, through back channels, to a human software engineer who had retired from contract work 5 years before the withdrawal and now lived quietly on a farm in New Zealand. He was politely asked if he might provide guidance on the diagnostic system. His response, delivered through his personal communications account, was brief. He said he would be happy to assist and that his consulting fee, payable in Terran sovereignty currency only, was considerable. He did not hear back. 2 months later, a second gate experienced a more serious structural resonance issue and was taken offline for emergency repairs. The offline period lasted 4 months. The trade routes it served were rerouted through lanes that were longer and more expensive, and the species most affected by the detour were the smaller, less politically connected ones who had the least ability to absorb the extra cost. Tavara's account of the Council's internal discussions during this period was illuminating. Several senior delegates pushed for a formal resolution calling on humanity to return to its previous role as a responsible member species. The resolution was drafted, revised 11 times, and ultimately tabled because no one could agree on how to phrase the request in a way that did not make it obvious that they were asking for help. There was a great deal of concern, Tavara said quietly, about how it would look. The irony was that while the council was worrying about how things would look, the independent trade landscape was quietly restructuring itself in ways that would prove far more consequential than any gate alignment issue. The Drev Collective announced, 14 months after the withdrawal, that they were opening a new commercial transit corridor through a region of space that the council had classified as navigational non-priority. The corridor had been surveyed and enabled using Terran-designed technology. The transit fees were set by the Drev Collective independently, which meant they were lower than the council's equivalent routes by a margin that could not be matched without the council operating at a loss. The first non-council species to use the Drev corridor was the Selhari, who needed to import replacement components for their medical supply chain. The second was the Murath, who used it to move survey equipment to their newly recognized home system territory. By the time the council's Commercial Standards Committee convened to discuss the corridor's status, it had processed more freight in 6 months than some council-approved routes managed in a year. The Drev Collective was also, it emerged, a founding member of the Solaris Web Communications Network, which by this point had expanded to cover 61 species and was actively recruiting more. The web offered something the Council's official communications network had never quite managed to provide: complete privacy from Council monitoring. For small species, independent traders, and anyone who had ever received an unexpected audit from the Council's compliance office, that privacy was worth a great deal. Tavara told me that the moment the Council realized the Solaris Web's membership had passed 40 species was the same week that 3 species which had previously held full Council membership quietly downgraded their status to observer. They did not make dramatic announcements. They simply filed the administrative paperwork. Council observers have no voting rights. They also have no obligations. They pay reduced fees. They receive reduced services. And they are, technically, free to conduct commerce and diplomacy independently of Council frameworks. It was like watching a building lose its structural points one at a time, Tavara said. Each one, individually, seemed manageable. A supply disruption here, a gate going offline there, a trade route shifting, a species filing a status change. None of it, alone, looked like a crisis. But from where I was sitting, with access to the documentation of all of it happening at once, I could see what the pattern was. What was the pattern? I asked. He looked at me steadily. That the Council had been dependent on humanity in ways it had never measured, never valued, and never thanked, and that in the absence of that foundation, the structure was settling. He was quiet for a moment. I went to Grethval, he said, 3 times. I brought him reports. I laid out the pattern as clearly as I could. I told him that the situation required not a diplomatic inquiry, but a genuine acknowledgement of what had been lost, and a meaningful offer of changed terms, not as a negotiating position, as a statement of reality. What did he say? Tavara's expression did not change, but his hands shifted on the table again, the same small movement as before. He said I was catastrophizing. He said that humanity's contributions had been useful but not irreplaceable, and that the Council had managed for centuries before humans arrived at any significant level of participation, and would manage again. Tavara paused. He said this in the same session where the Compliance Office reported that 11 previously human-maintained Council server nodes had gone offline due to expired support contracts, and that the backup systems were running on insufficient capacity. He paused for a moment, and I waited. I resigned my position 4 weeks later, he said. I told them I was seeking early retirement on health grounds, which was not entirely untrue, and then I contacted a Marath transport captain I knew, and I asked her to take me somewhere the Council was not. Why us? I asked. Why humanity, specifically? He considered the question with genuine seriousness. Because you left cleanly, he said at last. You closed the doors and you said nothing, and you built something new. Every other species I know of, when they felt wronged by the Council, either stayed and accepted it, or left in a way that was loud and damaging, and ultimately pointless. You did neither. He looked at me with something that I thought might be respect, though it was hard to be certain across the gap of 2 different kinds of face and 2 different histories. I wanted to understand how a species learns to do that. I thought about Adele Drummond's 6 words. I thought about Oren Malkiel's folding chair in a Reykjavik warehouse, 23 years before anyone else could see what he was building. I told Tavara that I thought it came down to a very old and very human understanding, that the most powerful response to being underestimated is not to argue about it, but to simply go and prove something. He nodded slowly. He said he was beginning to see that. The Terran Sovereignty Station had been operational for 2 years when the Council delegation arrived, and in that time I had received a great many visitors. Murath navigators arriving to formalize their star system surveys. Drev Collective Logistics Coordinators finalizing new trade corridor schedules. Representatives from 14 species who had signed bilateral agreements with us, coming to begin the second phase of those agreements. A handful of individuals from species who were not yet ready to formally align themselves with us but who wanted, quietly, to see what we had built. I had not received a council delegation until the morning I am about to describe. I was in my office when the notification came through. My assistant, a young man named Callum Hart who had grown up in Glasgow and had the particular quality of never being either ruffled or dramatic about anything, opened my door and said that the docking request had come in from a vessel carrying council registry markings and that it was asking for authorization to use Bay 7. I told him to grant it and to let me know when the delegation had cleared arrival procedures. Then I sat at my desk for a moment and thought about what I was going to wear. This is not a trivial point. I was meeting beings who had spent their entire political careers in environments where visual presentation was a carefully managed form of communication. What you wore told everyone in the room something about what you believed about yourself and about them. I had spent 9 years learning to dress in ways that signaled approachability and junior status, clothes that said we are reasonable and eager to cooperate. I was not going to do that again. I chose a deep charcoal jacket with clean lines, the kind of thing that says nothing decorative and everything structural. I reviewed my notes for exactly 40 minutes. Not because I needed to review them, because I had been thinking about this meeting for 2 months. I reviewed them because I wanted my mind to be as settled as my jacket when I walked into that room. Callum came back at the appropriate time to tell me the delegation was assembled in Reception Hall 1. I thanked him. I asked if he wanted anything before he started his shift reviewing the morning's communication logs. He said he was fine and gave me the small nod he used when he wanted to say something encouraging without making it a thing. I walked down the corridor and into Reception Hall 1. There were 6 of them. The lead envoy was a Kel-Shara High Arbiter named Vel Sorath, a being of considerable height, and the particular quality of stillness that senior Kel-Shara officials cultivate over decades of council service. 2 Vreth diplomats stood to one side, junior enough that I did not recognize either of them. A representative from the Selhari Medical Coordination Office, whose presence I found genuinely interesting, because the Selhari were perhaps the most honest of the council species, and the ones least likely to be present simply for performance, and 2 officials from the council's administrative secretariat, present, I assumed, to ensure that whatever was said was properly documented. No Greth Val. I noted that. I introduced myself, greeted each of them by name and title, and invited them to sit at the long table at the center of the hall. The table was a very good piece of furniture. It had been made by a craftsperson in Kyoto from a single piece of wood, and it was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have been made with complete and unhurried attention to what they are supposed to be. I had chosen it specifically, not to impress. To make clear, without saying anything, that we had time to do things right. Vel Sorath began with the formal council greeting, a structured recitation that acknowledges the history of the relationship between parties, their mutual standing, and the circumstances of the present meeting. It is a long greeting. It is designed to be long, because the length itself is a signal of seriousness. I waited until it was finished, then offered the human equivalent, which is shorter. "Thank you for making the journey," I said. "We are glad to receive you here." We, on behalf of Earth and the Terran sovereignty. Not on behalf of the Council, not as a member species, not as a returning party. Here, in our space, at our table. Glad to receive you, which is the language of a host greeting a guest. Vel Sorath had been a diplomat for 40 years. He caught all of it, and he was good enough not to react. He laid out the Council's position with care and some elegance. Humanity's departure had created a range of administrative and logistical complications that had affected multiple species negatively, many of them species that humanity had always maintained good relations with. The Council's senior delegates had, after considerable reflection, concluded that the circumstances surrounding the withdrawal had been handled in a manner that did not reflect the Council's best values. They were prepared to offer humanity full reinstatement to Council membership, with several expanded provisions, including a permanent seat on the Resource Allocation Board. He said it all very well. I acknowledged each point as he made it, not interrupting, not reacting, just listening with the careful attention that shows another person they have been heard. When he finished, I asked if he was ready for a response. He said he was. I said that humanity appreciated the seriousness with which the delegation had approached the meeting, and that we recognized the distance they had traveled, in more than one sense. I said that we had given the question of Council membership considerable thought over the past years, and had arrived at a clear position. We would not be rejoining the Council. I said this simply, in the same register I had used throughout, not hard, not cold, but completely level. The way you say something that is not a negotiating position but a fact. Vel-Sarath was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had hoped we might be open to discussing the specific terms of reinstatement, that the expanded provisions represented a significant departure from previous arrangements. I said that I understood, and that the terms were meaningful ones, and that they represented exactly the kind of change we had asked for 5 years ago. I said this without any particular emphasis, just as a statement of fact, because it was one. I then said that we had a different proposal to offer. I had brought one document to this meeting. I had thought carefully about bringing only one, not a folder, not a presentation. One document, printed on a single large sheet of high-quality paper, folded once, placed face down on the table in front of me. I turned it over and pushed it gently across the table toward Vel-Sarath. It was an accounting, compiled by Oren's team and by our own economic analysts over the preceding year. It showed, in very clear and simple numbers, what humanity had contributed to the Galactic Council ecosystem over the past century, versus what we had received. Not in vague terms, in specific ones. Supply volumes, research transfers, technical services rendered, trade flows, maintenance contracts, navigational data shared. Against those numbers, the fees we had paid, the votes we had lost, the resources seized, the proposals dismissed, the years spent waiting for a reform that never came, the math was not close. I let Vel-Sarath read it. He read it slowly, with the attention of someone who already suspects what they are going to find but needs to see it anyway. The Selhari representative leaned over to look at the same time, and I watched her face, because the Selhari are the most honest species I have ever encountered, and their faces show things that other species have learned to hide. She looked at the document, and then she looked at me, and something passed across her expression that was not anger or surprise, but something quieter, an acknowledgement. I continued. I said that humanity was not interested in returning to a structure that had produced those numbers. What we were interested in was building something different, bilateral agreements, negotiated individually with each interested party, on terms that reflected actual value exchange rather than inherited hierarchy. Every species at the table was welcome to begin that conversation. The process would be straightforward, the terms would be transparent, and the agreements would be binding under Solaris Web arbitration rather than council mediation. Vel-Sarath set the document down. He said that what I was describing was, in effect, a parallel governance structure that would fragment the council's authority. I said that was one way to see it. Another way was to see it as what the council had always claimed to want, a structure based on mutual benefit rather than hierarchy. He said that unilateral frameworks created instability. I said that dependent frameworks created fragility, and that the past 4 years had demonstrated that fairly clearly. There was a silence, not an uncomfortable one, or not only that, the kind of silence in which something shifts. Vel-Sarath looked at me for a long moment. He was a very composed being, and I had a lot of respect for what that composure cost him in this particular moment. He asked how long the offer would remain open. I said 30 days from today. He nodded. He looked around the table at his delegation, then back at me. He said they would need to consult with the broader council before responding. I told him that was completely understandable, and that we would be available for follow-up communications through the Solaris Web standard channels during the 30-day window. I stood up. They stood up. I walked them back toward the docking bay entrance, making conversation as we went, asking after the journey, pointing out the features of the station as we passed them, the same simple courtesy I would offer anyone who had come a long way to have a difficult conversation. At the entrance to the bay corridor, Vel Sarath stopped and turned to me. He said something that I want to record accurately, because I have thought about it many times since. He said, "You are very different from what I expected." I asked what he had expected. He considered this. "Someone who wanted us to understand what we had done," he said. I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, "I think you already understand. That's why you came." He held my gaze for a second longer than the conversation required. Then he inclined his head in the Kel Shara formal acknowledgement, turned, and walked into the bay corridor with his delegation behind him. I stood at the entrance until the corridor door closed. Then I turned and walked back toward my office, and I did not allow myself to stop and lean against the wall until I had made it to a section of corridor where there were no windows and no cameras. I stood there for about 30 seconds. I pressed my back against the wall, and I breathed slowly, and I felt my hands shaking inside my jacket pockets. Not from fear, not from excitement, from the particular physical relief of having held something steady for a long time and finally being in a place where it was acceptable to let go. Then I straightened up, checked my jacket, and went to find Callum to ask if he had managed to get any lunch. The log entry I am making now is timestamped from my cabin on the Terran Sovereignty ship Endurance, currently in the 6th month of a joint survey mission with a Drev navigation team. We are approximately 90 light-years beyond the furthest point any Council survey vessel has ever charted. The stars outside my porthole are ones that, until 3 years ago, had no names in any galactic record. We gave them names, simple ones. The navigation crew has a running system involving birthplaces, favorite foods, and the names of childhood pets. The star we passed last Tuesday is officially designated in the Solaris Web database as Endurance Survey Point 441C, and is unofficially called Piccadilly by the crew, because our second pilot grew up near London and said the system's color reminded her of the lights in winter. I like Piccadilly better. I started keeping this personal log 6 months into my appointment as Director of Terran External Affairs, and I have kept it every week since, which now means I have been keeping it for almost 7 years. I went back and read the earliest entries last night, looking for something specific, and I found it. In the third entry, written the day after I accepted the director position, I wrote, "I do not know if we are going to be able to hold this together. I know what we are trying to build. I do not know if it is possible." 7 years later, here is what I know. Of the 22 species that held full membership in the Galactic Council at the time of the withdrawal, 15 have now signed bilateral agreements with the Terran Sovereignty. 3 more are in active negotiations that I expect to conclude within the next year. 4 are still operating under Council-only frameworks, and those 4 are finding it increasingly complicated to do so, not because we have made it complicated for them, but because the independent trade networks have grown large enough that staying outside them has a real and measurable cost. The Council itself still exists. I want to be honest about that, because there is a version of this story where we walk out and the whole structure immediately collapses into dust, and that is not what happened. The Council is smaller and quieter than it was, and it has genuinely reformed several of its worst practices, partly because the species that remained were able to move faster without the old hierarchies dominating every vote. The patent framework was overhauled 2 years ago. The trade tariff structure was revised. There are human observers now at certain Council technical sessions, not as members, not as petitioners, just as observers, by mutual arrangement, because sometimes it is useful to have a room where everyone can look at a problem together. Adele Drummond is 70 years old now. She retired as Secretary General 3 years ago, and she lives in a village in northern Portugal, where she tends a garden and writes what she describes as essays about nothing in particular that always turn out to be about everything. I visited her last spring, and she made lunch and we sat outside, and she asked me how it was going. Not the official version, the real one. I told her about the things that had worked. I also told her about the things that had not worked, or had worked less cleanly than I would have wished. Because that is the part of this story I want to be honest about, here at the end, because the honest version matters more than the satisfying one. The transition years were not painless. When supply chains broke and council infrastructure failed, and the ripple effects spread outward, there were species that suffered because they happened to be dependent on things that stopped working, and those species had done nothing wrong. The Selhari patients who went without treatment for 7 months while the supply chain rebuilt itself were not political actors. They were just people who needed medicine. Some of the disruption could have been shorter if we had handled the transition differently. Some of it was structural and unavoidable. I have sat with that accounting many times and I do not have a clean answer to it. What I have is a commitment to making sure that everything we build now is built in a way that reduces dependence and fragility for everyone, not just for us. Oren Malkiel would say that the moral weight of that question is exactly why you build carefully. Why you test the foundations before you raise the walls. Why you spend 23 years making sure that when you leave cleanly and with something to offer, not just a hole where you used to be. He is currently overseeing the construction of the 4th Terran Sovereignty Deep Space Station, which will also function as the primary hub for the Western Arm Navigational Network, the project being built in partnership with both the Drev Collective and the Murath, whose home system is now fully recognized, and whose children are growing up in a place that belongs to them. I think about the Murath often, a species that waited 3 centuries for what humanity helped them secure in 12 years. There is something in that which I find both deeply satisfying and deeply uncomfortable, because it means that the waiting was not inevitable. It was a choice made by those in power to keep them waiting, and they kept waiting because they had no other option. Knowing that you could have moved faster, that the machinery existed to do better, and that it simply was not applied, is a particular kind of heavy knowledge. You carry it. You try to let it make you more serious, not more bitter. I have also carried, all these years, the memory of a Vreth ambassador sitting across a table from me, with his hands flat and open, telling me what it looked like from the inside when something you took for granted begins to come apart. Tavara works now as an independent consultant on cross-species diplomatic methodology. He has a small office on the Terran Sovereignty Station, a kettle that he uses to make a tea variant that smells nothing like any tea I have ever grown up with, but which he offers generously to everyone who visits him, and a particular reputation for being the person you go to when you need someone to tell you something you do not want to hear. He told me something once, about 6 months after his asylum was settled, and he had begun to find his footing in a different kind of life. He said that the hardest thing about the withdrawal, from the Council's perspective, was not the supply chain disruptions, or the gate failures, or the trade realignments. It was the silence. You never explained yourselves, he said. You never sent a message saying what you were building or what you intended. The Council spent months trying to read intention into absence, and they are not good at that. They are built for explicit communication, formal positions, stated grievances. Silence is not a language they know. I said that the silence had not been strategic. Not entirely. Some of it had been. But some of it had simply been that we had too much to do to spend time narrating it. He said he understood that now. He said that understanding had taken him a while. I keep thinking about this ship, the Endurance, and what it means that I am on it. 7 years ago, I was sitting in a gallery, watching humanity's last formal proposal to the Galactic Council be dismissed before it reached the floor. Today, I am 90 light-years past the edge of any charted space, on a ship crewed by humans and Drev together, mapping stars that have never had names. Nobody gave us permission to come here. Nobody approved this mission through a council transit committee, or assigned us a survey slot in the annual resource planning calendar. We came because we wanted to know what was out here, and because we had built the ships to come, and because the Drev Collective wanted to come with us, and because the Murath had given us charts that showed this region might be interesting. It is interesting. I cannot say more than that yet because the science team is still processing, but I will say that Dr. Lena Fortis, our chief survey analyst, spent approximately 3 hours yesterday with the expression of someone who is trying very hard not to shout, which in my experience means the data is doing something remarkable. I will find out when she is ready to tell me. I am in no hurry. We have time out here, and the stars are going nowhere. There was a knock at my cabin door a few minutes ago, while I was writing this. I said come in, and it was Sketh, the Drev navigation lead on this mission. She is the same Sketh that Oren had described to me years ago, the one who had spent 3 years watching us carefully before she was willing to discuss anything of substance. She is older now, and the clicking sounds of her language have developed a new cadence that her translator tells me indicates senior status emphasis, which means she has been recognized and promoted within the Drev Collective since I last saw her 4 years ago. She stood in the doorway of my cabin, holding 2 containers of something warm from the galley. She said, in careful human standard, that the view from the observation deck was very good tonight, and that perhaps I would like to come and see it. I saved this log entry. I closed my tablet. I took one of the containers from her, and I followed her down the corridor, through the quiet hum of the ship around us, toward the observation deck at the ship's forward end, where the stars we were moving toward filled the entire viewport like a question we had not finished asking yet. I stood beside Sketh and I looked at the stars. They did not care who we were, or where we had come from, or how long it had taken us to get here. They were just there, steady and indifferent and extraordinary, the way the universe always is when you finally stop waiting for someone to tell you that you are allowed to look at it. I thought about Adele Drummond walking out of a chamber, about Oren Malkiel in a folding chair, about a young ground crew worker grinning in an arrivals hall, about a Vreth diplomat with his hands flat on a table, about the Marath, finally home, about Tivara and his kettle, about Lena Fortis trying not to shout. I thought about my own hands, shaking in my jacket pockets in an empty corridor. I thought about 30 days that had become 7 years that had become this, a ship with no council registry, carrying people who had decided to go see what was out there, in space that had no name yet, surrounded by stars they were going to name themselves. The council had sent us their regrets. In the formal language of their official resolution, they had expressed regret over communication failures. It was the politest possible way of saying that they understood now what they had dismissed then. It was not an apology exactly, but it was the closest that a structure built on the assumption of its own permanence can come to one. I had written a formal acknowledgement of the resolution on behalf of the Terran sovereignty. It was brief, gracious, and said nothing that could be mistaken for a reopening. Standing at the viewport with Sketh beside me, watching stars that no one in the council chamber had ever bothered to chart, I thought about what regret looks like from out here. From out here it looks very small. Not because it does not matter. It matters. What was done matters, and what it cost matters. And the years spent waiting for something that was never honestly offered matter, in ways that I carry with me every day of my life. But regret, at this distance, is a thing that belongs to the people who stayed in the room. We are not in the room. We are 90 light-years past the edge of anyone's map, and the stars in front of us have never seen a council vessel, and whatever is out here is going to be understood by the people who were willing to come and look. That is not triumph. I want to be careful about that word because I think it is the wrong one. What it is this: a long breath finally let out, a door that was once closed and is now simply behind you, getting smaller as you move forward, until eventually it is not a door at all, just a point in the distance that tells you how far you have come. I stood there with Sketh until the galley containers were empty, and my back was pleasantly tired from standing, and I thought about nothing complicated and everything important, the way you only can when you are very far from where you started, and the view is extraordinary. Then I went to bed, and I slept easily, and in the morning the data team was ready to talk, and the universe, as always, had more to show us than we had yet thought to ask for.